Well, we are here in Fort Kent, Maine on a rainy late October morning, 2014, and we're at the fort at Fort Kent. And the reason why this fort was erected is because of something that was known as the Aroostook War. And I'm going to read the plaque here. The Aroostook War was an undeclared bloodless war that occurred in 1839. The peace treaty that ended the American Revolution in 1783 had not satisfactorily determined the boundary between New Brunswick and what is now Maine. Maine was part of Massachusetts until 1820. The boundary dispute worsened after Maine gained statehood in 1820 and, disregarding the British claims, began granting land to settlers in the valley of the Aroostook River. The King of the Netherlands was asked to arbitrate the dispute, but the U.S. Senate rejected his award in 1832, although the British accepted it. Canadian lumberjacks entered the Aroostook region to cut timber during the winter of 1838-1839, and in February they seized the American land agent who had been dispatched to expel them. The war, in quotation marks, was now underway. Maine and New Brunswick called out their militiamen, and the U.S. Congress, at the instigation of Maine, authorized a force of 50,000 men and appropriated $10 million to meet the emergency. That was a lot of men and money back in those days. Now, this is a very interesting point. Maine actually sent 10,000 troops to the disputed area. Well, these 10,000 troops were actually members of the Maine militia. And the population of Maine back then, I imagine, was a whole lot smaller. Today, it's a little more than 1 million. So a large percentage of the population of the state actually came up here to attempt to settle the dispute. Here we go. Maine sent 10,000 troops to the disputed area. U.S. President Martin Van Buren dispatched General Winfield Scott to the war zone, and Scott arranged an agreement March of 1839 between officials of Maine and New Brunswick that averted actual fighting. Britain agreed to refer this dispute to the Boundary Commission, and in 1842 the Webster-Ashburton Treaty settled the matter. The compromise reached by Daniel Webster and 1st Baron Ashburton awarded 7,015 square miles to the United States and 5,012 to Great Britain. Retention by the British of the northern area assured them of year-round overland military communications with Montreal. Webster used a map said to have been marked with a red line by Benjamin Franklin at Paris in 1782 in persuading Maine and Massachusetts to accept the agreement. Britain agreed to pay these states $150,000 each, while the United States agreed to reimburse Britain for expenses incurred defending the area against encroachment. And here's the song, the Aroostook War fighting song, which I'm not going to sing. So, we're up here mainly this time around for a speaking engagement for my good friend Dan McGonigle. And Dan is going to discuss very briefly why we need to reinstate the constitutional state militias. Well, Dan, what do you say?
Well, the reason being the state militias are the enforcement mechanism in the U.S. Constitution for constitutional security, for economic security, enforcing the requirement for constitutional money, and also enforcing the Constitution itself. Article 6 says the laws are this Constitution and the laws made in pursuance thereof. And Article 1, Section 8, Clause 15 states that when necessary, the militia are to execute the laws. And when necessary, that would be that you could take that from the first clause of the Second Amendment. A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state.
Well, Dan, let me ask you a question. When people talk about the militia today, most people will say National Guard, and the National Guard of a given state is comparatively small to what was had here. We talk about 10,000 militiamen in Maine in 1838 when the population was a whole lot less. What's the difference? Isn't it the same thing?
The National Guard?
Yes.
No, the National Guard is now, today, it's controlled by the Army and the Air Force and the Department of Defense. But the U.S. Code, the current U.S. Code says that the National Guard is also the organized militia. So what's happened is they've joined two powers under Congressional Section 8 powers that are not to be joined. There's the Clause 12, Army of the United States, and then there's the Clause 15 and Clause 16, militia of the several states. So the militias of the several states, the Army, Air Force, etc., are of the United States.
So in essence, we don't have a militia today.
We do not.
We have something called the unorganized militia, which is really unconstitutional. And what do you recommend? How do we get the militia back? The constitutional militia. What do we do? What do the viewers of this video, what do you recommend they do?
The people need to look into this subject matter and educate themselves. Organize and instruct their state legislators, and it can be done, it all can be vitalized by the passage of one bill in the state legislature of any state.
And what sources do you recommend? What writers or books do you recommend? Besides yours, of course.
Besides mine.
And what is the name of your book?
Execute the Laws to Restore the Republic.
And where can you get it?
It's on Amazon.
Okay, and who else? What other great sources?
The top expert on this also is the top constitutional scholar, I would say hands down in the 21st century, Dr. Edwin Vieira Jr. of Virginia. And he's published thousands of pages on the subject.
Okay, and we can find him on News with Views, is it?
Newswithviews.com. He has a
WorldNet Daily.
Newswithviews.com. He has a running short commentary since 2005.
Okay, great. All right. Well, Dan, thank you.
You're welcome.
Now we can get dry.
Yep.